This is the moment the world feared for decades. Minutes ago, multiple American cities were struck by a coordinated nuclear attack. Washington, D.C., Norfolk, San Diego, and Offutt Air Force Base, headquarters of U.S. Strategic Command, all hit. Communications across the eastern United States are unstable, civilian networks collapsing. The world is entering the darkest chapter in modern history. But this video isn't about the impact. It's about what happens next. Because the instant America is hit, the entire NATO alliance is forced to respond. This is World War III, NATO's first counterstrike, a minute-by-minute reconstruction of the first 3 hours. The Pentagon's emergency protocol. Inside the Pentagon's surviving command bunkers, the National Military Command System goes into full lockdown. Officials follow SIOP-FLASH, a rarely used directive that triggers automatic multinational notifications. Within 2 minutes, every NATO capital receives the same encrypted message.
The United States has suffered a confirmed nuclear strike. Invoke Article 5. Execute continuity of government.
Even without a president able to respond, NATO procedures do not wait. Article 5 automatically moves into active defensive mode. Countries across Europe instantly transition to DEFCON 2 equivalents. Air raid sirens begin in Warsaw, Oslo, Berlin, London. Skies suddenly fill with tankers, AWACS aircraft, and stealth fighters. NATO nuclear forces on the move. The U.S. nuclear triad was hit, but not crippled. America's submarine fleet remains intact, and NATO's own nuclear states, Britain and France, shift to immediate readiness. Royal Navy response. 1 Vanguard-class SSBN already on patrol. 1 Astute-class hunter-killer shadowing Russian naval activity in the Arctic French response. 1 Triumphant-class SSBN moves from passive patrol to first strike readiness. French Air Force Mirage. 2,000 N Squadron scramble to nuclear alert bunkers. Across Europe, strategic bombers begin rolling out of underground facilities. But NATO is still operating blind. America's satellite network was disrupted. They need eyes. European airspace transforms. Within minutes, Europe becomes the most heavily defended airspace in history. In Poland, F-35s lift from hardened shelters, silent, invisible on radar. In Norway, F-16 take position along the Barents Sea, scanning Russian missile paths. German Eurofighters begin escorting AWACS and NATO tankers. Spain launches air refueling missions toward the Atlantic. The alliance is pivoting from defense to the beginnings of retaliation. But NATO cannot authorize a counterstrike without confirming one thing: who launched the attack. Every intelligence agency knows the origin, but NATO still must verify, legally and militarily. And Europe has only minutes before incoming missile waves could hit them. First confirmation: missile tracks. The shock wave of the American attack knocked out portions of the U.S. space-based IR system, but European radars are still functional. NATO's BMU's radars in Fylingdales, UK, Thule, Greenland, and Vardø, Norway, all deliver the same analysis. Initial trajectories consistent with Russian submarine-launched ballistic missiles. The call that world leaders dreaded for generations is now a confirmed fact. NATO knows who the attacker is. And under Article 5, every nation must act. On NATO's nuclear consultation group convenes deep under Brussels in NATO's secure conference center. The nuclear planning group activates. Representatives from United States, United Kingdom, France, Poland, Germany, Italy, Spain, Turkey, all join in a live, encrypted session. The conversation is direct and haunting. America has been struck. Deterrence has failed. We must respond immediately, or we invite more attacks. The debate lasts 54 seconds. NATO authorizes Operation Thunder Shield, Phase 1. Neutralize Russian nuclear launch platforms, cripple Russian command networks, preserve NATO's surviving forces. prepare for limited nuclear retaliation. But to strike back, NATO needs accurate targeting, real-time, flawless, verified. This requires satellites. European satellites take over. With the U.S. surveillance network disrupted, Europe launches rapid response observation protocols. German SR Lupe satellites sweep the Arctic. French Helios, 2 shifts to track Russian submarine wake patterns. NATO's Joint Satellite Ground Station in Italy processes missile plume data. Within minutes, NATO identifies 2 Russian Borai-class SSBNs in the North Atlantic, 1 in the Norwegian Sea, 2 missing. Potentially preparing a second wave, NATO's counterstrike is now forming. Silent orders to NATO submarines. Deep in the North Atlantic, British and French ballistic missile submarines receive a cryptic 3-symbol code. No words, no explanations. Just the signal that activates pre-launch targeting. Inside the command deck of HMS Vigilant, a captain opens a locked safe. Inside, 2 half-burned paper cards. He verifies codes with a second officer. Then he whispers, "Target package November is now live." This gives Britain the authority to prepare Trident II missiles with warheads on standby. France performs the same protocol. The counterstrike is now in motion. The European frontline awakens. Eastern Europe knows it is next. Poland's entire Patriot and Aegis ashore network goes online. Romania activates its terminal phase interceptors. Finland floods the air with drone-based EW jammers. Every NATO member anticipates that Russia will attempt to disable European command centers before NATO strikes back. This is the most dangerous moment in world history. A nuclear-armed alliance preparing its first counterstrike versus a nuclear-armed state anticipating retaliation. One mistake could launch hundreds more warheads. Russian fleet movement detected. Satellite sweeps detect Russian strategic assets shifting. Northern Fleet ballistic submarines diving deeper. 2 Kirov-class cruisers accelerating toward the Norwegian Sea. Rapid scrambling of Russian Tu-95 and Tu-160 bombers. But NATO's surveillance also detects something more urgent. A Russian airborne operation mobilizing near Kaliningrad. If Kaliningrad launches tactical nuclear strikes at Poland or Germany, NATO must hit it first. The clock now accelerates. NATO activates counterstrike air assets. Ramstein Air Base, Germany. Dozens of stealth bombers and fighters rise from underground bunkers. NATO's strike force includes U.S. B-2 Spirit bombers, surviving ones, British F-35Bs, French Rafales with ASMP, nuclear missiles, Norwegian F-35, as Polish F-16S with advanced SAD packages. AWACS aircraft circle above them, turning Europe's skies into a live tactical map. The counterstrike formation is assembling, but NATO still needs final authorization, and that can only come from one place. U.S. continuity of government restores. Contact near Colorado Springs. Emergency communication bunkers activate a backup satellite relay. A surviving U.S. National Command Authority, possibly the Secretary of Defense or a designated successor, finally connects to NATO. The first sentence is short but historic. "We are alive. Continue, Thunder Shield." With U.S. command back online, NATO now has the legal authorization to execute its first major counterstrike. But which target should it strike first? Command bunkers, submarines, ICBM silos, airfields? The decision must be precise. Target prioritization. In Brussels, NATO's analysis teams rank Russian targets by threat level. 1. Submarine launch platforms. Most dangerous, mobile, stealthy, and capable of second strikes. 2. Nuclear command and control nodes. If NATO eliminates Russia's ability to authorize launches, escalation slows. 3. Airfields housing nuclear bombers. Tu-95 and Tu-160 aircraft must be disabled before they lift off. 4. Kaliningrad missile batteries. Close-range tactical nukes threatening Poland, Germany, and the Baltics. The counterstrike blueprint is finalized. Operation Thunder Shield, Phase 2, Precision Neutralization. NATO is minutes away from launching the largest coordinated strike in its history. Europe under threat, incoming detections. NATO radars suddenly detect multiple hypersonic objects rising from Western Russia. The alliance braces. Is this a second nuclear wave? DOTA arrives seconds later. Hypersonic glide vehicles, non-nuclear payload, potential anti-satellite and anti-airfield weapons. Russia is attempting to blind Europe before NATO retaliates. Within minutes, air bases in Poland and Latvia brace for impact. NATO must move faster. NATO's retaliatory countdown begins in the Joint Air Operations Center. Officers begin the launch sequence. On encrypted headsets, pilots hear the message, NATO is executing a defensive counterstrike. All aircraft proceed to phase lines. Submarines confirm missile readiness. Ground forces prepare for mass mobilization. But NATO is not striking with nuclear weapons. Not yet. The first counterstrike is designed to prevent further Russian nuclear launches by crippling launch systems. This is the last moment to step back. No one chooses to. First, NATO strike wave launches a storm of NATO cruise missiles bursts from ships, submarines, and aircraft. Tomahawks from U.S. destroyers, Storm Shadows from UK and French aircraft, JASSM-ERs from Polish and U.S. fighters, naval strike missiles from Norwegian vessels. They streak across the Arctic skies toward Russian submarine pens in the Kola Peninsula, airfields near Murmansk, radar installations near Arkhangelsk, nuclear command bunkers outside Severomorsk. Russia scrambles interceptors, but cannot stop them all. The first NATO counterstrike has begun. Russian early warning, panic. The sudden NATO missile wave triggers alarms in Russia's military leadership. Russian generals receive fragmented data. Cruise missiles, incoming NATO bombers, active unknown submarine activity. Loss of communication with one Northern Fleet outpost. They must decide, is this NATO's nuclear retaliation? Russian doctrine states, if command believes a decapitation strike is underway, nuclear launch authority is granted to regional commanders. This is the moment the world was never supposed to reach. Russia prepares to activate mobile ICBM units deeper in Siberia. NATO must stop them. Fast. Second NATO. Strike wave, anti-submarine, focus. NATO deploys P-8 Poseidon aircraft from every available base. Sonobuoys blanket the Norwegian Sea. Hunter-killer submarines move to intercept Russian SSBNs. British Astute-class submarines engage in silent pursuit. U.S. Virginia-class boats join the chase. In the deep Atlantic, the most dangerous hide-and-seek game in human history begins. Whoever loses a continent. Baltic region ignites. Kaliningrad activates its nuclear-capable missile batteries. NATO surveillance detects them minutes before launch. In response, NATO executes the most precise airstrike in its history. Polish F-16s, using stealth cruise missiles guided by Swedish airborne radar, destroy key Iskander launchers. French and British aircraft wipe out remaining battery sites. Kaliningrad's nuclear role is neutralized, for now. Europe mobilizes millions. Across Europe, full mobilization begins. Germany activates homeland defense brigades. Poland deploys 150,000 reservists. France moves armored divisions. East Turkey fortifies its Black Sea. Coast Finland pushes troops toward Lapland. Civilian networks broadcast emergency evacuation orders near military bases. NATO expects that if Russia retaliates, Europe will feel the impact next. Russian submarine loss confirmed. A Norwegian P-8 identifies a massive underwater explosion northwest of Tromsø. Intelligence confirms one Russian Borei-class SSBN neutralized. NATO commanders hope this reduces the likelihood of a second nuclear wave. but 4 submarines remain unaccounted for. Russia scrambles to avoid collapse. Russian leadership attempts to stabilize command structures. Generals relocate to hardened bunkers. Mobile nuclear command trucks deploy across the Urals. Russia prepares its strategic bombers for launch. But NATO is already moving on them. NATO strike on Russian airfields, B-2. Spirits carrying deep penetration ordnance strike. Engels Air Base, Olenia Air Base, Ukranka Long-Range Aviation Base. These targets house Russia's strategic bombers, the same aircraft that once carried nuclear payloads. Runways are cratered, command centers collapse. Russia's bomber threat is significantly reduced. Critical decision in Brussels. NATO now faces the next stage. Should they execute Phase 3, the neutralization of Russian ICBM silos? This would be seen as a direct attempt to eliminate Russia's deterrence, which could trigger all-out nuclear war. Debate erupts among member nations. The US, UK, and Poland argue, if we don't stop the silos now, millions more could die within minutes. France, Germany, and Italy argue, if we strike the silos, Russia will launch everything. This must stop at counter-value restraint. The alliance reaches a compromise. Phase 3 will target only mobile ICBM units, not fixed silos. The goal is not to destroy Russia, but to prevent Russia from destroying Europe next. Europe's crowning moment, Operation Iron Net. NATO activates a final emergency measure, Iron Net, a pan-European missile shield using all nations' interceptors in a single coordinated network. It combines Aegis Ashore, THAAD Patriot, PIASI, 3SAMP/T, NASAMS EW jamming systems. Space-based infrared tracking from France and Italy. Europe forms the most advanced missile defense shield ever executed. This is meant to stop any Russian retaliation that may come after the counterstrike. NATO ground forces cross-align. Along the eastern flank, NATO mechanized units begin pushing toward potential Russian launch sites in Kaliningrad and Belarus. This is no longer just an air and naval war. It is becoming a continental conflict. Russia sees this as escalation. Final NATO counterstrike actions. NATO's last actions in the first 3 hours. French Rafales launch anti-radiation missiles to cripple Russian radar. British submarines reposition for shadow operations. U.S. cyber units initiate attacks on Russian command. Bandwidth Polish drones swarm across the Suwałki. Gap Spanish and Italian missile frigates intercept Russian long-range drones. NATO is trying to disable Russia's nuclear launch capabilities without triggering a global annihilation scenario. The balance is impossibly delicate. The situation. After 3 hours. 3 hours after the first nuclear strike on U.S. soil, NATO actions. Neutralized 1 Russian SSBN, crippled multiple air bases, disabled Kaliningrad's nuclear batteries, weakened Russia's command and control, established Iron Net, defensive shield, mobilized millions of troops, launched coordinated cruise missile barrages. Russia lost key assets, sustained heavy damage in the Arctic and Baltic regions, maintains remaining submarine forces, is preparing a response, has not yet launched a second nuclear wave. The entire world now holds its breath, because everything that happens next depends on a single decision made in Moscow. Does Russia escalate to full nuclear retaliation, or does it attempt to negotiate before total destruction? The next hours will determine whether civilization survives or ends. If you want Part 2, WW3, NATO's ground offensive, Hour 3 to Hour 12, let me know in the comments. And subscribe for more timeline breakdowns of global conflict, nuclear strategy, and real military escalation scenarios. This was WW3, NATO's first counterstrike. The next 3 hours. After the U.S. is hit, stay safe, stay informed, and hope this remains only a simulation.